The first thing you need to understand is that nobody in that ballroom was supposed to survive the night. The second thing you need to understand is that they did because of her. The cameras caught everything, every broken wrist, every dislocated shoulder, every precise, almost surgical movement she made across the marble floor in a floor-length black dress and bare feet, her heels abandoned somewhere near the appetizer table. 12 million people would watch that footage before sunrise. Think pieces would be written, talk shows would argue, but none of them, not a single one, would be able to explain what Amara Dlamini truly was until they understood where she came from. So let's go back. The light in Cape Town that morning was the kind that made the city look like it was apologizing for something. Pale gold, low and thin, as if the sun itself wasn't sure it belonged there. Amara sat at the edge of her apartment's small balcony with both hands around a mug of rooibos that had long gone cold. She wasn't drinking it, she was just holding it. There was a habit she'd never been able to shake from the field, having something in her hands that wasn't a weapon. A mug, a pen, a phone she wasn't actually looking at. It kept her from tensing. It kept strangers from reading her correctly. She was 31 years old, and she had been out of special forces for 14 months. She'd left with a commendation she never framed, 2 citations she'd buried at the bottom of a drawer, and a scar that ran from just below her right ear to the edge of her jaw. Not long, not dramatic, but permanent. A reminder that the last assignment had almost gone differently. She wasn't bitter about it. She wasn't anything about it, which was part of the problem. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen without moving her head. A name she recognized, Darius and Gama, former handler, currently running a private security consultancy out of Johannesburg that she'd done 2 jobs for since her discharge. Competent work, clean money, nothing that asked too much of her. She answered. "There's a contract," Darius said, skipping everything. He always skipped everything. "I'm listening." "Kang Industries, you know them?" She did. Everyone did. One of the 3 largest tech conglomerates operating across the continent's digital infrastructure boom. Fiber optics, satellite contracts, AI licensing deals with 4 different governments. The founder, Kang Myung-jin, had built the company from a hardware workshop in Seoul into a 40 billion rand empire over 20 years. His son, Jun Seo, was being positioned as the heir apparent. Amara had seen his name in the business press, mostly in contexts that made him sound like a liability. Parties, public arguments, a leaked voicemail where he'd told the board what they could do with their quarterly projections. "They need a protection detail for the son," Darius continued. 3 months minimum, could extend. There have been credible threats. Intelligence out of Johannesburg and Nairobi both flagging activity from a competitor group. Not random, targeted, professional, patient. Who's the competitor? A pause that told her the answer was complicated. Varian Systems. They've been trying to acquire pieces of Kang's infrastructure contracts for 2 years. The father won't sell. The theory is they're moving to destabilize the succession, create enough uncertainty that the board forces a sale to stop the bleeding. Amara finally took a sip of the cold tea. She looked out at the pale gold city and thought about the cold tea and the drawer with the citations at the bottom of it, and the 14 months of competent, clean, quiet work that asked nothing of her and given nothing back. She said, "Send me the brief." If you're new here and this is your first story with us, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We drop cinematic stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. She landed in Johannesburg on a Tuesday. The Kang Industries driver who picked her up from the airport was a man named Femi, who had the good sense not to try small talk. He drove her to a tower in Sandton that was mostly glass and the kind of architectural confidence that quietly said, "We have never had to apologize for anything." The lobby was cool and white and smelled like money. Not old money, not the musty inherited kind, but new money, recent money, the kind that had been fought for and knew it. She was shown to a conference room on the 14th floor where 3 men in suits were already seated, looking at her the way men in suits often looked at her when they'd expected someone else. Not hostile, exactly, just recalibrating. Their eyes moved over her. The scar, the posture, the way she set her bag down without looking for permission, and they recalibrated, and then they recalibrated again, and none of them ever quite arrived at the right conclusion. Miss Delamy, the one in the center, said, older, gray at the temples, the careful stillness of a man who had sat through 1,000 meetings and learned how to project calm he didn't always feel. I'm Director Park, head of corporate security for Kang Industries. We appreciate you coming on short notice. Tell me about the previous detail, she said. She didn't sit down. Director Park blinked. We were going to start with the threat assessment. I'll read the threat assessment. Tell me about the previous detail. 3 weeks, then they quit. Why specifically? There was a beat of silence. The 2 men flanking Park exchanged a glance that she filed away without reacting to. Mr. Jun-so is resistant to structure. He has strong opinions about how he chooses to move through the world, and he made them look useless in public, so they left because their professional reputation was more important to them than the contract. That's fine. I don't have a reputation to protect in this sector. I have a job to do. Tell me his full schedule for the next 2 weeks, every location he considers private, and which members of his personal staff have had their background checks updated in the last 90 days. Another silence. Then Park reached for the folder in front of him. She sat down. Jun-so Kang was not what the press made him. She had expected, based on the profiles, the voicemail, the 3 weeks, something loud, something performative in its defiance, the way rich men who'd never had real consequences sometimes performed rebellion. She had expected ego that filled the room before he did. Instead, she found a man sitting cross-legged on the floor of his home office at 10 in the morning, surrounded by circuit boards and printed code sheets, and 3 empty coffee cups, wearing a faded university hoodie and arguing quietly into his headset in Korean. He didn't look up when she entered. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Tabo, had brought Amara to the doorway and then retreated like someone stepping back from a small fire. Amara stood in the doorway and waited. She was good at waiting. He finished his call, pulled the headset off, rubbed the back of his neck, and then finally looked up. He had his father's bone structure and none of his father's boardroom composure. His eyes were sharp and a little tired and immediately, visibly assessing, taking her apart the same way she was taking him apart, which was the first interesting thing about him. "You're the new one," he said. His accent was mid-Atlantic with Korean undertones, the product of international schools and too many countries. "Amara Dlamini," she said. He looked at the scar. He was the only person that day who'd looked at it without looking away immediately. "Does it bother you when people ask about that?" "Most people don't ask, they just wonder." A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more provisional than that. "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really think I need a bodyguard. My father is being paranoid, and the board is being paranoid because my father is, and it's all—" He made a gesture with his hand that managed to dismiss the entire threat apparatus simultaneously. "There were 2 attempted intrusions at your Nairobi facility last month. One of your lead engineers received a personal threat at his home address, which means someone has access to residential information that isn't publicly available. 3 weeks ago, a car followed your vehicle for 4 blocks in Santon before turning off. Your previous detail noted it. You told them they were being paranoid. You're not in danger of paranoia. You're in danger of the other thing." He was quiet for a moment. "What other thing?" "Certainty," she said. "Certainty that it won't happen to you is more dangerous than any weapon anyone can point at you. It makes you predictable. Predictable people are easy." Something shifted in his face. Not defensiveness. She'd expected defensiveness. This was something else, something closer to the expression of a person who has been told something true by someone who has no reason to lie about it. "Okay," he said. He uncrossed his legs and stood. He was taller than she'd expected. "What do you need from me?" That was the second interesting thing about him. The first 2 weeks were friction, then rhythm. The friction was minor. He had an instinct for spontaneous decisions, for changing plans last minute, for treating his own schedule as a suggestion rather than a document. She corrected for it without confrontation. When he decided at 9 p.m. to visit a contact across the city, she was already moving. When he tried to shake her in a building he thought he knew better than she did, she was waiting at the other exit with her arms crossed and an expression that communicated precisely nothing. He laughed the first time. The second time, he stopped trying. The rhythm came from an unexpected direction. He was curious about her in a way that wasn't invasive. It was technical almost. He asked about threat assessment the way she'd once seen engineers ask about load-bearing structures, genuinely, specifically, with follow-up questions that suggested he'd actually processed the first answer. Late one evening, sitting in the back of the car after a long day of meetings, he asked her what the hardest part of close protection was. She thought about it. She gave him the real answer. Getting someone to take the threat seriously without making them afraid to live their life. Fear changes behavior in ways that create new vulnerabilities. You want them alert, not frozen. He looked at her sideways. Is that what you're doing with me? Making me alert without making me frozen? I'm making you less predictable. That's the first requirement. And me asking questions, does that make your job harder? She considered the city moving past the windows. No, it means you're paying attention. Paying attention helps. A beat of silence that sat differently from the previous silences. Easier, less measured. For what it's worth, you're nothing like I expected. She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away from the window with any particular urgency either. Then the gala invitations arrived, and everything tightened. The Kang Foundation's annual charity gala, held every year at the Aurelius Grand in Santon, was a fixed point in the corporate calendar. Canceling it would send signals to the board that Jun-so's father could not afford to send. Attending it meant placing Jun-so in a public, high-traffic, high-camera environment for 4 hours, which was the precise description of what Amara would have chosen to avoid. She spent 3 days on the venue. She walked every corridor, mapped every entrance and exit, identified the 5 positions from which a professional could operate with maximum efficiency, and identified the 2 positions she liked least. She coordinated with the venue's security team, 3 of whom she trusted, 1 of whom she quietly moved off the guest-facing floor. She designed a communications protocol, positioned Femi at the rear entrance, and requested 2 additional personnel from Director Park's team. She told Jun-so all of this in a briefing that she kept under 15 minutes, because she'd learned that was his attention threshold for operational detail. He listened, he nodded, he said, "I trust you." She heard the words and registered them in the way she registered most personal statements during a protection assignment, with a small, careful partition between the professional weight of them and anything else they might mean. She was good at the partition. She'd built it over years. What she didn't tell him was that 2 days before the gala, she'd received an intercept from Darius, sourced from a contact in the Varian system's orbit, that suggested the gala wasn't just a vulnerability, it was a target, a chosen one, a date and a venue that someone, somewhere in Varian structure, had circled on a calendar long before the invitations were printed. She didn't tell him, because telling him would have produced one of 2 outcomes. He'd either try to cancel, which wasn't possible, or he'd try to be brave about it in the specific way that untrained people were brave, which was by overreacting at the wrong moment. Neither outcome helped her. She went back to the venue and walked it again in the dark, after closing, alone. The light in the empty ballroom at 2 in the morning was a different animal from the chandelier bright spectacle it would become. It was residual, the dim service lighting that caught the edge of tables and the underside of the suspended crystal and made everything look like the set of something that hadn't been filmed yet. She stood in the center of the floor and turned slowly, mapping it again with the colder, quieter part of her mind. Whatever was coming, it was coming here. She pulled off her shoes and walked the length of the floor in bare feet, because she was going to need to know the exact sound her movement made against that marble. The night of the gala arrived dressed in gold and noise. 300 guests, one live stream broadcast for the foundation's donor network, a detail that would matter enormously later. The chandeliers were at full wattage, throwing light across the kind of crowd that wore clothing that cost more than most people's monthly rent and moved with the particular practiced ease of people who'd never needed to watch the door. Amara wore black. She'd had the dress chosen for range of movement before she'd chosen it for anything else, but it worked on both counts. Her heels were a calculated concession, visible enough to signal guest, practical enough at 3 inches not to cost her footing. She kept one earpiece in, the other ear open to the room. Junseo found her first. He came across the lobby toward her with an expression she'd never seen on him. He was nervous, and he wasn't hiding it particularly well, which was somehow more disarming than if he'd tried. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, and he'd done something careful with his hair, and he looked, in the specific way that some people manage to look, like he'd been thinking about this moment before it arrived. "You look," he started. "Operational," she said. He laughed despite himself. "I was going to say remarkable." She kept her eyes on the room behind him. "Earpiece working?" "Yes." He glanced at his ear. "You know, most bodyguards don't require their clients to also wear communications gear. Most bodyguards aren't me." They moved into the ballroom together. The crowd absorbed them. Handshakes, introductions, the particular choreography of a room full of people performing their own importance for each other. Junseo was good in rooms like this when he chose to be. She'd watched him decide to be good at it, which was different from someone who did it naturally, and she found she respected it. 90 minutes in, she felt the shift. It was nothing visible, no sudden movement, no raised voice, nothing the cameras would have caught at that moment. It was the quality of attention in 2 men near the east corridor, the way they weren't watching the stage, the way their drinks weren't diminishing. The eyes moved in the specific pattern of people looking for exits rather than entertainment. She pressed the earpiece. "Femi, check the east service entrance, now." Femi's voice came back 12 seconds later, lower than it should have been. "There's a van. It wasn't on the approved vendor list. I'm counting." The feed cut. The room was still bright and gold and full of conversation and music, and everything was normal, and Amara was already moving. "Junseo," she said quietly, appearing at his elbow mid-sentence with his CFO. "Excuse us." He read her face. He stopped mid-word and followed her without asking. She had him moving toward the north corner, the position she'd identified as the most defensible, good sightlines, 2 solid walls, when the east corridor doors opened. There were 4 of them. Professional looking, which was the right word. They didn't have the chaotic energy of opportunists. They moved with the particular economy of people who had rehearsed this, who knew where they were going and who they were going to, and 300 people in a ballroom didn't register as an obstacle, only as a variable. One of them had already spotted Junseo. Their eyes found him before Amara could place him fully behind the north column, and for half a second, the choreography of the next 30 seconds was already written. Then Amara stepped out of it. She moved left, which was away from Junseo and toward the threat, and the first man had less than a second to realize the geometry had changed. He reached, and she was already past his reach, her left hand redirecting his wrist with a force that used his own momentum, her right elbow finding the precise junction of his jaw and neck that didn't require strength, only placement. He folded. The room hadn't screamed yet. It was still in the brief, terrible moment between something happening and people processing that something had happened. The live stream camera, which had been pointed at the stage, swung automatically toward the disturbance. The second man was faster. He adjusted, closed distance, and Amara felt the shift in the floor beneath her. She'd worn 3-inch heels for 4 hours, and now they were gone, kicked somewhere near the centerpiece, and the marble was cold and exact under her bare feet, and she knew it. She'd walked it at 2 in the morning, and she knew every centimeter of its resistance. She took the impact of his first grab on her shoulder, turned with it rather than against it, redirected. The dress held. She'd chosen well. The third man had produced something from his jacket, a taser, not a firearm, which told her the objective was retrieval, not elimination, which meant Jun Sao needed to be invisible immediately. "Northeast exit, now, run," she said in the earpiece, clipped and final, and she heard movement behind her that she trusted without checking. What followed was 43 seconds that 12 million people would eventually watch in slow motion from 6 different camera angles, including the venue's security system and 3 guests' phones, and the live stream that had swung toward her and never swung back. 43 seconds of someone who had trained for years in conditions that had no glamour, no chandeliers, no audience, doing exactly what she'd been built to do in the most public room imaginable. The fourth man ran. The first 3 did not. The aftermath was the long fluorescent kind, police lighting replacing chandelier gold, the paramedics arriving with their particular calm efficiency, the guests pressed in clusters near the far wall, some of them crying, some of them filming, most of them doing both. Amara sat in a chair near the north column with a cut on her left palm she hadn't noticed acquiring, pressing a cloth napkin against it with the abstract attention of someone whose adrenaline had not yet finished metabolizing. Jun Sao appeared from her peripheral vision. She wasn't supposed to be back in the room yet. She'd had Director Park's men hold him in the northeast corridor until clearance, but he was here, and he was walking toward her with an expression she didn't have a clean category for. Not the relief of someone whose physical danger had passed. Something more complicated, something that had been quietly building in the spaces between operational briefings and late-night car rides, and one specific honest answer to a question about fear. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her hands, he looked at the cloth, he looked at her face. "Are you—" he started. "I'm fine." "That's not—" he stopped, started again. "I need to say something, and I'm probably going to say it badly, so—" he exhaled. "You just, in there, I watched you through the corridor window, and I don't have the language for what that was." He pressed both hands to his face briefly. "That's not what I was going to say. What I was going to say is that I've been trying to say something for 3 weeks, and every time I almost say it, you do something operationally competent, and I forget all the words."
She looked at him. He was not performing any of this. His jacket was slightly disheveled from the run, and his carefully arranged hair was not anymore, and he was looking at her with the same unpartitioned directness he'd had in that first meeting on the office floor, when he'd asked about the scar and not looked away. "You're not supposed to develop feelings for your protection detail," she said. "I know." He didn't look even slightly apologetic about it. A silence moved through the room around them, the investigators speaking quietly, the guests being directed toward the lobby, the distant sound of camera clicks. The chandeliers were still on, throwing gold over everything, which seemed wrong and right at the same time. "The assignment is still active," she said. "I know. Varion still has resources in play. Tonight was probably the opening move, not the whole campaign." "I know that too." He glanced at her hand. "Do you want someone to look at that properly?" "In a minute." "Okay." He nodded. He didn't move. I'm not asking you to, I know this isn't. I just needed you to know that I see you. Not what you just did, not the operational competency, not the," he exhaled. "You. As a person. I see you." She looked at the cloth on her palm. She looked at the chandelier light on the marble floor. She thought, briefly and precisely, about the partition, the careful thing she'd built over years to keep the professional weight of a statement separate from anything else it might mean.
The partition was still there, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't entirely sure it was load-bearing. "Talk to me in 3 months," she said. He absorbed that. Something in his face settled. Not disappointment, not satisfaction, the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had been given something real instead of something easy. 3 months, he said. He said it like it was a promise, or maybe a date. The footage went viral before dawn. By morning, she'd received 11 interview requests, 3 job offers from other agencies, and a call from a cabinet minister's office she chose not to return. She didn't watch the clips. She read the threat assessment update from Darius over black coffee, cross-referenced it with the intelligence on the fourth man who'd run, and updated her protocols for the next phase of the assignment. Her phone kept buzzing. Outside the window, Johannesburg was fully lit now, no pale, apologetic gold, just the direct morning light of a city that had decided something had shifted. She thought about Cape Town, about the drawer with the citations, about 14 months of work that had asked nothing of her. She thought about a question asked on a floor covered in circuit boards. Does it bother you when people ask about that? Most people don't ask, they just wonder. She picked up her coffee, she read the threat assessment, she planned for what came next, not because anyone required her to, but because she was built for the middle of things, for the space between danger and safety where most people chose not to stand. That was who she was. 12 million people had watched it now. A few of them understood it. Most of them had simply watched a woman in a black dress and bare feet on a chandelier-lit marble floor do something clean and precise and exact, and felt, in the particular wordless way that truth sometimes lands, that they had seen something real. She closed the threat file. She opened a new one. The work continued.